Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
Rebecca Johns.
Hi there. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm so excited to be talking about this book. So, can you tell me a little bit about Virus City and also your other writing?
Yes. Well, thank you so much for having me. Virus City is a Big Shoulders Books publication. Big Shoulders Books is the in-house publishing arm of the English department at DePaul University in Chicago. And we put out a volume every year and a half or so with a social justice focus, because that's DePaul University's mission, urban, Vincentian Catholic, and focused on social justice in some way, shape, or form. So originally, I was a journalist. That's what I went to undergrad for many, many years ago, and switched to fiction writing in my 30s, and went to Iowa for my MFA. But, I've never lost the love of telling true stories. So I was a magazine writer for many years. So my colleagues at Big Shoulders have been doing these wonderful projects for years. We did How Long Will I Cry? Stories of Youth Violence. It was all about, street violence affecting the youth of Chicago. That was the first volume. There's I Remember, which is about Chicago veterans of war. American Gun, which is a long form poem about gun violence. And The Garcia Boy, which is kind of memoir that was uncompleted by the author, and the students in our program worked with the author's widow to put together a final draft. So we've done a number of these. And so I was very interested in doing something myself to help out the program and to, chip in my time and effort toward one of these volumes. And originally it was going to be focused on incarceration. So my idea was to go into the jails and the prisons, run writing workshops with DePaul students, and choose from among the pieces that were produced in those workshops an anthology of prison writing.
Oh, that sounds fascinating.
Yeah, so that was my original plan. And, I say this in my intro to Virus City that, COVID didn't care about my plans. So we were in the middle of planning for this, had just begun kind of taking the first steps toward making it happen with some of the folks at DePaul's Inside Out program, which is a prison education program, when everything locked down. So, like most people, I kept hoping that a couple weeks, maybe a month, and everything would get back to normal. And of course, we know how that went. So throughout the summer and into the fall, I still kept in touch with some of the folks I had reached out to about doing this volume, hoping that we would be able to pivot to doing workshops again or figure out some solution that was going to work. And as people probably remember, the prisons were an early vector for the disease. Things went quite badly there, and the prisons locked down. By the fall, it was pretty clear there was no fall of 2020. It was pretty clear they were not going to be letting me in to run the workshops that I'd wanted to do. And even reaching out to the prisoners through unofficial channels hadn't turned up any submissions, at least not enough submissions to actually do a full volume. So in thinking about it, I realized, this is a once in a lifetime pandemic. I think it's affecting everyone in significant ways. And so it made sense to pivot to that. So when classes started in January 2021, that became our focus. So I taught 4 classes on this throughout 2021, gathering narratives from all over the city, sending my students out first to write the narratives. And then in the fall, we worked on editing the narratives until we had enough to choose from for the whole volume. And so what you what you see is a kind of a result of that student effort overseen by me. The students were really the ones writing the pieces, conducting the interviews. I taught them how to conduct an interview, and then I taught them how to take that raw material from the interview and craft it into a narrative. And then the fall courses were focused on editing, taking those first drafts and kind of reshaping them into more solid drafts. And then since December of 2021, I've been personally focused on, doing the final polish on those, as well as fact checking, copy editing, proofreading, working with the designers. And one of the things that makes this volume different from some of the other Big Shoulders volumes is that we have several photo essays in the middle. So my co-editor is Robin Hooker from the College of Communications. She's a photojournalism teacher, and she had some of her students were doing their photo assignments in spring 2020 and captured some of the protests that were happening in downtown Chicago, as well as their lives during lockdown. And so when we discovered that these wonderful photos were out there and existed about the pandemic, we thought, oh yeah, we have to have these as part of the book too. So in addition to the written essays, written narratives, you'll see several photo essays, very powerful stuff about what DePaul students were dealing with in the spring of 2020, especially.
That is also amazing.
Mm-hmm.
How did the photo essays become a part of it? And also, kind of off of that, what was it like getting how many people had to weigh in on that? On that being a part of the anthology?
Well, that actually came about because my colleague Miles Harvey, who's the one of the co-founders of Big Shoulders and the director of the DePaul Publishing Institute, met Robin and learned that her students had produced these photos. She actually published a piece in Pointner about trying to teach photography when all the students were on lockdown and had to go home to their families, some of them downstate, some of them in neighborhoods with poor Wi-Fi access and, difficulty connecting to online classes. So when he came in and said he'd seen these fabulous pictures and was I interested? Of course, I was interested. Mm-hmm. And so Robin came with all her students. She sent me files and files and files of great stuff, but it was really up to her to choose which pieces made it in for photographic quality, for narrative quality. And of course, photojournalism is such a wonderful medium for storytelling. And so having these photo spreads became a kind of a central part of what we were going to be doing in the book. 4-color photo spreads. Printing these days isn't cheap. But it was wonderful to be able to include the photos along with the black and white.
Oh, that is so cool.
Mm-hmm.
What was it like for the writing process with this, working with so many people and having
mm-hmm.
it be over the course of courses? And
it was it was really a year. It was kind of a year planning and then a year executing and then like another 9 months now to actually get the final printed item. But the students were absolutely incredible. I'm always blown away by how smart they are, how thoughtful. They came up with things that I didn't even know were possible sometimes. It was a challenge, right? Because we were already not meeting in person. In the past, these books have been gathered in person. The students would go out to meet the people where they live, maybe at a cafe or something and meet them face to face. And that was not an option for either for the students or for the subjects, right? So in order to do these interviews, they did them all over Zoom. Almost all of them were done over Zoom, which, has some advantages and some drawbacks. You can see right now, for example, that the bed behind me is unmade.
Oh yeah, I have my camera angled up right now, but I'm sure it's all.
We had company. We had company last weekend, and I'm washing the sheets, and so you can see into people's homes, and so you get a little bit more personal look at who they are. But it also becomes kind of a barrier. Because you're not meeting in person and you aren't talking face to face. And, some of the subtle cues about body language, et cetera, are much harder to read on Zoom. And Zoom's a lot more tiring for people to do for long periods of time. So they were real troopers. The other advantage of Zoom is it has the automatic record feature, as we know,
True.
since we're using it right now. But so the students could record it and then use mechanical transcription usually for the first pass, and then go through it again and fix the things that mechanical transcription gets wrong, which it always does. But that was how they went out and got the initial interviews. And so, the focus was on the city. Again, our mission at Big Shoulders is urban. We're specifically interested in paying close attention to underserved communities on the south and west sides. So, if there was someone who, had an interesting story, we were always asking ourselves, how does it amplify or the voice of people who don't normally have a voice? And especially during COVID, our working thesis was that, the society we live in already has inequalities. How was COVID amplifying those? And so we wanted to find the people who weren't going to traditionally have a voice and listen to them. Because I had already been reaching out to groups working with incarcerated individuals, I did get to interview several people who were incarcerated and who were released during 2020 and 2021, which was fascinating. We had several students do narratives from them and from a family, the mother of someone who's incarcerated. We have a female EMT who has been working during COVID. I love her narrative. It's so fascinating. A couple of doctors, a couple of nurses, several teachers in different kinds of schools. Some are private schools. One was at a mental health facility. One was working in the city. One was working in Cicero in a near suburb. And so we get different perspectives on how teaching was going in their different communities. And retail workers, someone who worked at Walgreens, someone who worked at Starbucks, and how they were managing during the pandemic. So, the students would go out and gather this raw material, these raw narratives. And when you transcribe them, it's very question, answer, but the finished narrative we try to read as if it's a single long piece in the person's voice. First person as told to kind of magazine piece. So, trying to make the pieces read smoothly, make them flow, make them make sense, how, one subject leads to another subject leads to another, what to leave out, what to leave in. So that was the editorial process that we took in the fall when the graduate students kind of took the raw materials, the raw narratives, and shaped them into these final pieces. I mean, they did an absolutely fantastic job. It was a labor of love. It was so much work.
It sounds like
it. But yeah, really a ton of work. I know one of the questions you had mentioned you were going to ask was if I had to cut anything, and we did.
I was actually just about to ask that one because you were telling me all about going through everything and changing things around.
That was the other thing. We used How Long Will I Cry as kind of a template. Right. So How Long Will I Cry was the first book that Big Shoulders put out. It's very successful. It's been, I think we've printed over 20,000 copies and we shipped it all over the world. And so we were kind of using that as our model for these, with these short introductions that the students would write themselves, and then the longer narrative in the subject's voice in the first person. But we were also looking kind of macro at what was being included, how we were going to order things throughout the entire book. And so we started and ended with medical professionals. I felt like that was really important.
Yeah, because they were so impacted, obviously, by the pandemic,
yes.
and I love especially what you were saying about how there's such a focus on helping amplify the voices of underserved communities and
Mm-hmm.
like people whose stories don't get told, because there was a push to tell more of those stories during the
Mm-hmm.
pandemic, but it's nowhere near enough. And
Exactly.
books like this are so helpful for that.
Yeah. Well, that's what we're hoping for, also to have kind of a record. This past summer, we're still having a surge, but the world has moved on from COVID. Like, whether we're actually done with it or not, it feels like people just want to be done with it. So I wanted to have like a record of what happened while it's still fresh in everybody's mind, right? So even as we've been talking, I have to remind myself fall 2020, spring 2020 versus 2021 versus 2022.
It all bleeds together because pandemic time.
It does. It feels like a different set of, like a bubble of time that just exists on its own. And so I think it's easy to forget what those early days were like. And so, I wanted to kind of have something for the historical record about what it was like to be here during COVID and what people were dealing with and living through, and where they were suffering and where they were thriving. So, and there was suffering, and there still is suffering going on. But there's weird amounts of joy too. So, and that's a strange thing to say, but how many of us saved a ton of money because we weren't spending it on anything, or
communities came together in a lot of ways, even though when everyone was separated, especially very early on in the pandemic.
We have these wonderful new tools like Zoom. I think of, my daughter's 14. She did almost all of middle school in COVID and during COVID, and she got to still see and talk to her friends because they had technology that made it possible. What would this have been like, 50 years ago when, I was a kid, right? Things would have been very, very different. And so some things have not been terrible about it. And I think the book does highlight where those have happened, but a lot of people had very legitimate complaints about things that they were suffering through. And so, I think it's very interesting to hear from them. Parents have different complaints than teachers did, for example. They're coming at things from very different perspectives. Medical professionals have a different view than others do. And so getting a chance to actually hear what it was they were dealing with on a day-to-day basis is fascinating. I learned some stuff that I was really, really interested in. So I hope other people find it as fascinating as I did.
It does sound so fascinating. I love what you were saying about it being like a record of that, because it's important to have something so organized, because right now it's kind of like, well, we have like all the news articles as it was breaking. We have everyone making tweets about it and stuff that you can go back at. But the fact that it's all online, some of those things could be archived or lost, and like it's good to have something kind of more physical like this, where you can look and go, wow, this is like direct from the person what it was like.
And all of Big Shoulders books go into DePaul's archives, so they have kind of a record of this for future generations. And so I love having just that little bit to contribute.
That's fantastic. Did you have a favorite story in this book?
Oh, there's one that I'm sad I had to cut. It was from a woman who was a female business owner who just was so raw and so honest. And when I went back and was doing the final fact check, she's like, "No, I can't let you run this." And I'm like, "Oh, please don't." And she did. She asked me to pull it, and I had to. So I'm still sad about that one. I really like the female EMT. She
Mhm.
too was very raw and honest, and just had such a funny and interesting voice, so unique and personal to her. I really love her piece. I really love some of the pieces from the formerly incarcerated gentlemen who were
Mhm.
released during COVID,
That
because
would be really interesting.
yeah, they're almost like time travelers. They're let out of prison and they don't know how to do anything. Most of them had been in since the early 90s. And so they didn't know how to use an ATM machine. They didn't know how to use a smartphone. It's like the world changed while they were inside. And so hearing it from their perspective was really fascinating to me.
Mhm.
Obviously, since I was originally going to do the book on that subject, I'm interested in that subject. But, um, you know, they had a unique perspective as people who had been in lockdown and then were released into a different kind of lockdown. So that really meant a lot to me. I find those particular narratives just endlessly interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too.
Mhm.
So you mentioned how you were communicating with the incarcerated people and finding
Mhm.
people for that, but what other ways did you go about finding people to submit for this?
A lot of them were the students. They came up with some fabulous ones. The female EMT was
Mhm.
one of my students. Found her
Oh, cool.
and did the narrative for her. Uh, Female business owners in Logan Square, for example, or Wicker Park. My students found them. A lot of the retail workers were folks that my students found. Um, Sometimes it was through social media. If I had students who just, for whatever reason, didn't have any luck, we tried really hard to get a police officer and just had no luck getting a police officer who's willing to speak with us on the record. Um, so sometimes they would come back and say, I haven't had any luck. I haven't had any luck. So I'd blast on social media. Anybody, I need a teacher. That's how I
Mhm.
ended up with almost all the teachers in the book. I need a nurse. Is anybody willing? And so sometimes friends of friends would answer. Sometimes, people I was connected to would answer and say they were willing to be interviewed. Um, but we're looking for as kind of as broad a swath as possible of people who are kind of on the front lines of these issues during COVID. There's a 12-year-old girl in the narrative who in the collection who spoke to one of the students. Again, it was just through another student. She said, I know somebody who has a little sister who'd be willing to talk. And she didn't use her real name, so she's protected, but it's wonderful. It was a wonderful little interview that she did, and it's just great to have her in the piece in the book. But yeah, we were trying to get as broad an overview as we could. Business owners, retail workers, medical professionals, parents, anyone who was affected by COVID, which is almost everybody. So it
Mhm.
ends up being kind of has a good variety of different voices. It's not just all one kind of story over and over again, because everybody's experience of it was a little bit different. We have an activist in there. Uh, like I said, there's a gentleman who worked in a mental health program for teenagers. All kinds of very interesting things. Almost all of them are in the city. Um, there were a few pieces I did end up having to cut because they were kind of not, they were a little bit off topic.
Mhm.
The students would come in, somebody who they were interested in what this person was working on, but it didn't really have anything to do with the pandemic. And because the book is fairly long, it's about 250 pages, I did have to cut a few things just for space. But yeah, I think we ended up with a good variety of voices from all over the city.
That's incredible. And the pandemic affected everyone. So
Yeah.
it's so good to see that there's such a diverse range.
Yeah, exactly. That was the idea.
Mhm. Could you tell me
So
a little bit? Oh, I'm sorry, what were you going
no,
to
no,
say?
no, no. I was just I'm still basking in the glow of picking them up today. The physical copies, just today, I saw them for the first time. So,
Oh, that's so exciting. What was that like? Can you tell me a bit about?
I mean, it's always.
finding?
I've published 2 novels and short stories, and my work's been in magazines. It's so tactile to pick up a physical publication with your work in it, and especially something like this that I worked on for so long, and so many people contributed to. It just feels very satisfying.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that sounds
So,
amazing.
yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you before. Go ahead.
Oh, not at all. I love to hear about moments like that. I ask a lot of authors on here to tell me like, what was it like when you got to pick up the book?
Mm-hmm.
Have you been able to show the students yet?
Not yet. No, they're not back in school yet. But I'm going to be sending mailers out. We're having a panel at Printers Row book fair in Chicago, not this coming weekend, but the following weekend, to celebrate the book launch. And several. My co-editor, Robin, the photojournalism editor, is going to be on the panel. One of her students is joining us. One of my students is joining us. And a couple of the contributors.
Ah, that is so cool.
Mm-hmm.
But before we go, could you tell me a little bit more about Big Shoulders Press and like what it has coming up and what we can expect from it in the future?
Mm-hmm. Well, probably the most unique thing about Big Shoulders Books is that we do not sell our books. They are all free. Mm-hmm. So because of DePaul's social justice mission, we feel it's very, very important that people not have to pay if they want a book. So anytime you want a Big Shoulders book, you simply have to go to the Big Shoulders website and request one, and we will ship it to you. So all of our efforts are supported through charitable donations. Our printing costs are supported entirely through charitable donations. Obviously the labor is donated by DePaul, the DePaul faculty who work on these programs and facilities, but the printing costs itself, which is not insignificant, especially these days, is supported by charitable donations from the Beck family, and we're enormously grateful to them. That's probably the most important thing to know. And like I said, our mission is very much urban focused, Chicago focused, and meant to support and amplify voices from underserved communities in Chicago. So our students all work on every single book, every volume that's produced in-house is produced in concert with our students. Our students write, edit, in some cases design things that we're publishing. We have at the graduate program at DePaul in writing and publishing, we also have a poetry journal, and we have a nonfiction journal focused on urban environments that's edited by my colleague, Barry Jean Borich. And so people who are interested in writing and learning things about the publishing industry, our students come from all over the country and all over Chicago to learn to be better writers and to get skills in working in publishing. So that's who we are.
That is so fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. I just have one last question, and that is, what do you have coming up?
Well, I am taking a sabbatical.
Amazing. Rest.
Yeah. So I'm looking forward to that. That I'm teaching this fall, but then in winter and spring 2023, I'll be taking a sabbatical to work on a new novel of my own. I don't want to say more about it right now than that right now, because it'll probably change significantly, and then I'll be like, I said too much. But yeah, I have a couple of other projects I'm interested in, and so I'm hoping to. Now that Virus City is out in the world, I'll have more time to get back to my own writing.
That is fantastic. Well, good luck with all of the writing and on your sabbatical and everything. Thank you again for coming on.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me, Molly. It's so nice to meet you.
Oh, it was great to meet you too. For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
I'm Rebecca Johns.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after. The end.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. You can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook at Read Between the Lines Podcast and on Twitter at RBTL Podcast. Make sure to follow the authors who I've been talking to hear all about their upcoming projects, and also because they're cool people. This show is hosted by me, Molly Southgate, and produced and edited by my dad, Rob Southgate. Read Between the Lines is a Southgate Media Group production, and you can find all the great content put on by the network at southgatemediagroup.com. You can read the story of how I and many other podcasters started in the anthology book Pod Life, which you'll find at the link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to buy the books featured on this episode. Using those links supports this show and the incredible authors being interviewed. Have a great week and keep reading.